Much has been said and debated about global warming, how it will erode our coastlines and deplete the ozone layer. And deforestation threatens to extinguish our rainforests and habitats for millions of species. But the threats to our natural resources extend beyond our climate and forests. No less important are the effects that our agricultural and other practices are having on some of our smaller creatures. Welcome to the Massachusetts School of Law Educational Forum, produced by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen nationwide. I'm Holly Vitsky, and today we will explore the environmental impact of two of our declining resources, bees and bats. Rick Rowe is president of the Massachusetts County Beekeepers Association and owner of Bee Cause Apiaries in Tingsboro, Massachusetts. Rick has been keeping honeybees for more than 12 years, and he explains why bees are so important.
Bees are very important. They will pollinate your trees that produce fruits or nuts. Honeybees in the United States pollinate $15 billion worth of food. Of all the pollination that is done, which is important to, again, agriculture and your environment, honeybees do 75% of it. By the nature of their colony, they're large colonies. Sometimes they can reach numbers of 75 to 100,000 bees. But probably on average, there might be 50 to 60,000 bees in a hive during peak season. So maybe they're not individually the best pollinators, but they certainly do the majority of the pollination due to their numbers.
What are some of the problems facing bees today, both locally and globally?
There's a lot of problems facing bees. I guess on the top of my list locally would be pesticides. The high use of pesticides in agriculture and in our landscaping has a real detrimental effect on honeybees. The second thing is foraging. Honeybees need to constantly forage for fresh food. That's their nutrition. And when there's a lack of foraging due to our urban development, the health of the honeybee can really suffer.
What is colony collapse disorder?
Colony collapse disorder was something that was happening mostly with commercial beekeepers, probably started about 10 years ago now, I would think, where the colony that would be, say, a thriving colony of 50 or 60,000 bees would dwindle down to maybe less than 100 bees in a matter of a very short period of time, a few days. The researchers have tried to figure out why this is happening, and we don't have an answer. It could be a multitude of things, because when they go and look at this hive, these hives have evidence of hive viruses, have evidence of fungal spore disease, nosema, have pesticide levels in the hive. It's like a perfect storm. So it's almost trying to figure out what happened first, the chicken or the egg, and did the viruses and did the nosema disease, did all those things come first and followed by the pesticides, or was it the other way around? And it's hard thing for them to figure out. But it's an area, it attacks suddenly, and it's very regional. I don't think we've seen much of it in New England, although some people will claim that they've had colony collapse disease. Sometimes it's just a collapse due to the other things that we talk about. But the thing about colony collapse disease is that the hive will dwindle. Not only will it dwindle down to almost nothing, but there'll be a queen will be present in the hive. There'll be brood and honey present in the hive, and then a few bees. And usually in that case, when a hive loses population and becomes weak, the other area honeybees will come in and rob out all the resources that are in the hive. In this case, the honeybees don't do that. They leave it alone. It's like they don't want anything to do with it. And that's pretty unique for that particular disease.
How pervasive is it worldwide?
It is a problem worldwide. Different countries will give different reasons. I think one of the main concentrations is to banned nicotinoids, which are pesticides that are systemic. These pesticides come up through the ground, and they are stay in the plant and in the ground for long periods of time, 10, 20 years, sometimes even more than that. And these pesticides will kill bees. One example is as like a nerve agent, and so the honeybees rely on a navigation system. So they use the sun to navigate. So they leave a hive and they come right back to the same spot using the sun. And if these pesticides are somehow affecting their nerves and their ability to navigate, it could be one of the explanations why bees fly out and don't come back.
Do organic farming methods help?
I think anytime we go organic, it has to help. And the problem is honeybees can fly a mile or 2 miles away, so they can cover a lot of territory. Generally, they don't want to. They want to forage nearer to their hive, but if there's nothing available near the hive, they will go those longer distances. So if you have an organic farm, especially in, say, Massachusetts, our farms tend to be smaller, and so the bees can fly beyond that area and reach other areas that may be into a higher pesticide use.
How does one get into beekeeping?
I would recommend that anyone that's interested in beekeeping, you contact your local county beekeeping organization and ask them when they are teaching classes, and take a beekeeping class. The second thing you'd probably want to do is get a mentor, somebody that's been keeping bees and is knowledgeable, that you can talk to throughout your first season and ask questions to. That's probably the best way to get into beekeeping. Beekeeping in the United States is really regionalized because we all have different weather patterns. So because of the weather patterns, it will diversify how you keep bees. Very difficult to keep bees in New England because of our long winters. When you go down south, their growing season might be 9 or 10 months long. So they would keep bees differently down south than we do up in the north.
Do you need a lot of land, or is it little space? Do you need space from your neighbors? What do you need to actually get into it?
There's a lot of phobias against bees, so there's certainly, it's an advantage if you have a lot of land, but you don't need to. There's certainly a lot of city beekeeping now, New York City, Boston, where people keep bees on top of high rises or triple deckers. You need to have a little bit of common sense for your neighbors. You want to place bees in an area that it's not going to be a high traffic area and people won't be walking in front of them. But honeybees are very docile. They're interested in flying out, finding flowers, water, pollen, whatever they're looking for, and bringing that back to the hive. And they're not the type of bees that fly around your Coke cans or your summer cookouts. Honeybees don't do that.
Is it an expensive hobby?
It can be a little bit. The initial startup cost, if you took a course and you buy protective clothing and you buy a hive setup and you buy honeybees, you could be looking at $500 or $600. And then as you increase each hive, it might cost you $200 or $300 as you increase each hive after that. Some people will start with 1 or 2 hives, and then if they find they like it, they jump up to 10 or 20 hives even in a few years.
How and why did you get into beekeeping?
When I was a little boy, my uncle kept bees at my grandfather's house. And he would, a few times he would dress me up and take me out there and show me the bees. And I remember just a lot of bees flying around and the noise. And that just stayed with me. And as I got older, I was probably in my I was probably about in my mid-30s. I asked my uncle if he still kept bees, and he didn't, because in the 1980s, mites kind of wiped out almost 75% of all the bees in the country. And it wiped him out and he got out of beekeeping. So I got a hive. He helped me out the first year. And then he got back into it the year after. And he's retired and he keeps about 20, 25 hives, sometimes 30. And we're working our way up. I started my first year with one hive. At the end of the year, I had two. And then the next year I went to 10, and we've kept building. So now this season we're hoping we'll be at about 400 hives by the end of the year, and we're hoping to get to 500 next year.
Wow. And you also run the New England bees?
So the name of my company is New England Beekeeping, and the name of my honey is Carlisle Honey. And so we do a few things. We teach beekeeping, and we sell beekeeping supplies. We sell honeybees to start your beekeeping. And then we manage our hives. When we have pollination contracts, we produce honey. We supply honey to probably about 40 or 50 stores and farm stands. And then we sell honey online at carlislehoney.com. We sell and ship honey throughout to everywhere in the country.
And you've had no complaints from your neighbors here about the bees?
No, actually, I haven't. We've all lived in this neighborhood for over 20 years, some of us as many as 30 years. And a lot of times people don't even know the bees are there. Occasionally, if it gets real hot in the 90 to 100 degree temperature, bees will visit swimming pools because they collect water, bring it back to their hive, and then they circulate the air to cool it down. So when it gets real hot, they forage more for water, and people will see them sometimes at their swimming pool, but they're only going to take a little drop and go back home, so it's not that bad.
So what can we do to help?
You know, one of my things that I like to push is to plant things that bees go to. And if we're giving up our fields and our large tracts of farming land, a tree can make up for a lot of that. And we have a lot of flowering trees that flower at different times of the year, and planting a tree that a bee might go to is probably one of the best things that we can do. But bees like herbs, they like clover, we can always use the internet and Google things that honeybees work, and we can produce a long list of trees and plants that the bees like to work, and that will help a lot. I've always noticed when I do my hive inspections that the part of the season when we have a lot flowering, the bees are bringing a lot of honey and pollen in. They're always at their healthiest. The colony looks strong, the brood pattern looks good, and then as the season dwindles and there's not as much food available to them, that's when you start to see a decline in their health.
So if everybody just bought one flowering shrub or tree, how much of a difference would it make?
Well, probably more than one, I would have to say, but I think it would make a big difference. I think when we have subdevelopments in either commercial or residential, and if we plant a diversity in our trees, things again that flower, I think that will go a long way. And then if individually as homeowners, if we do the same thing, yeah, I think it will go a long way. You see a lot of success in city beekeeping because there are a lot of flowering trees that were planted years ago, and I think we got away from that. Or they've been cut down and replaced with trees that aren't flowering because they got too big. But if you look at old town centers, a linden tree, for example, is a good example. There used to be a lot of linden trees, and those would bloom in July, which was a good time for things to bloom in the beekeeping world. And now we see less and less of that. We see wetlands that we're losing. Sometimes there's a conflict between beekeepers and, say, people that don't like invasive plants. Purple loosestrife is a good example. There's been a large movement to eradicate or or strongly diminished the amount of purple loosestrife that grew in our wetlands. So there was a movement to breed beetles that would eat that purple loosestrife. Well, that's really knocked down. Purple loosestrife is something that blooms in July and August. So that plant has been almost eliminated in certain areas. And so now we see at that time the bees don't have much to work, and it really takes down the health of our colony. So there has to be concerted effort if we decide to, take out a major honey plant, to make sure that we replant with things that will flower and that'll be good for the honeybees. Because without the honeybees, we don't get that pollination for our own food.
Massachusetts School of Law. Legal education that is practical, accessible, affordable, and enjoyable. Offering flexible day and evening classes, full or part-time studies, where candidates are assessed not on the LSAT, but their academic and other accomplishments, providing more professional skills training than any other law school in New England. Massachusetts School of Law. Visit us at mslaw.edu, training students to become successful lawyers and advocates, not just legal scholars.
Warm Colors Apiary in South Deerfield, Massachusetts is owned and operated by Bonita and Dan Conlon. As director of the Eastern Apicultural Society and president of Franklin County Beekeepers Associations, Dan has extensive knowledge and experience with honeybees. He revealed to us the biggest problems facing the honeybees today.
The number one thing that is talked about a lot now is just the loss of habitat. And it's sort of the combination of lost nesting sites for the native pollinators, which has reduced their numbers. And the other thing is just the lack of forage, meaning flowers. In the case of bees, it's a loss of flowers in sufficient numbers to keep large populations of bees. Now, where we are in western Massachusetts, we still have a lot of native species, and they're in good shape. We do surveys all the time when we do apple pollination in the spring, and I will typically count 15 or 25 different insects on apple trees pollinating, most of which are, with the exception of the honeybees, most of them are native species. And coming off a mild winter like we just did, the trees had plenty of native species. Now, you go to the cranberry growers in the eastern part of the state, and they're struggling with having enough pollination of the cranberries. The lack of forage out west, there was actually discussion at the Eastern Apicultural Society meeting last week where some of the commercial beekeepers were talking about the need. There'll eventually come a time when beekeepers will have to rent space to put their bees in prime locations because there's so little of it left. And it's hard to imagine in this whole country that would be a problem, but the agriculture has changed. We plant what we call fence post to fence post, so we leave no unkept areas that are suitable for native bees to live. We use lots of herbicides to get rid of weeds in crops, so there's no weed plants to feed these bees. And that's not just a U.S. problem, that's something that we're seeing throughout the world. As our populations increase, we have sort of manicured the planet and kind of put things in our own image as we would like it, and that's taking away weeds and all these natural plants that actually have a purpose of feeding wildlife. So the habitat and forage is the first thing. Western Mass, we have black bears. Black bears are a huge problem out here. Everybody has to put up electric fences to keep them out. And the other things that we have are mites, varroa mites, which are a parasitic mite. Probably the number one pest that bees have, and that's also a world problem. But we've identified bees that actually have heritable traits that they will remove the mites from each other, and they will remove mites that are in the brood that's not yet matured or hatched out. And so that is something that as we raise bees, we select for that behavior, and that's improved that situation tremendously and continues to work through that. So the final thing I would say, when we talk about things like colony collapse disorder, and the reason there has been no specific disease identified is that most of us have come to the conclusion that this is a reflection of multiple stressors in the environment coming together at the same time. And although bees are really pretty resilient and through history have overcome and adapted, when you throw dozens of things at them all at once, they can't sort of adapt to one thing and move on to the next. It's all coming at them at the same time. It lowers their immune systems and their ability to sort of stay healthy. And so you see the hives sort of dwindle and die off and get all these other problems. So, you know, it's a complicated problem. I think part of the difficulty with that question is that we live in a society where simple answers are what we all want. And the media has not really given good enough explanations of all the intricacies and the variables that come into play with this. So you can't sort of lay it off on, for example, just pesticides. Pesticides, of course, are a problem for any insect. And in the wrong places, you see that as destroying bees quite a bit. I think that's probably more the issue they have in California. Around here, I don't see it as a big issue. In the last 12 years, I don't think we've had a pesticide incident, and we're in a lot of different parts of the valley here, and on a lot of different kinds of farms. But for the most part, farmers are much more aware than they used to be, and they're smart, and they understand the importance of warning me if they're going to spray something that might harm the bees. And so the relationship we've developed is part of our minimizing risk of these things. So there's a lot of things bees are susceptible to, but one of the things we also sort of have an optimism about is that we know that the social honeybee has been on the planet for about 200 million years. So this is an old game that these bees have played over the years, and they've survived all kinds of natural disasters and things in the past and kept coming back. So they're actually a very resourceful species given their opportunity. So
How significant is the bee die-off in the United States?
very significant. The estimates, the averages have been running at about 30 or 35% die-off every winter. One of the things we discovered a number of years ago in Massachusetts was there was a period where we weren't really asking this question, but we started asking the question, well, how many hives do you lose during the summer? The winter was always an obvious place to ask the question. And we realized that some summers we were losing an equal number of bees in the summers. So that's been one of the, by the way, it's been one of the problems nationally is we don't have good data on exactly what the real numbers are. These are all based on interviews with a limited number of people or beekeepers, and they, you know, and even the researchers who are gathering this information are talking about ballpark figures because we don't know exactly. What we do know is that if you come out here in the spring, we typically lose about 10% every year. Now 10% in bees is really nothing. That's easy. We can replace that easily with the bees we have left over. So we haven't seen big die-offs lately, but prior to, say, 1982, there was a point there when you couldn't keep your bees alive in the winter. We were losing 80 or 100% at times. And we still hear of people having those kind of die-offs in the winter. So when you say a 30-35% average, that's based on the fact that some people are losing 10% and some people are losing 70 or 80%. So if you're one of those 70 or 80% people, you're taking some big financial hits, especially if you're trying to do this as an occupation.
How much does organic farming help?
I think it helps quite a bit. One of the things that we look at is, you know, first of all, farming, I think, gets a bad rap a lot of the time, particularly the farmers I'm familiar with, because the real chemical threat right now, I think, is more in lawn care. It's the runoff from lawn care. And homeowners who are buying organic sometimes will say to me, as you go to their house and you realize, oh, you have this pristine lawn, how do you do that? Oh, I have these people who come and they spray it. Well, do you know that nicotinoids are in that spray? which is just a generic killer of all insects. Anything that's an insect dies from this stuff. And that's, you know, bought over the counter in Walmart by the gallon. I mean, it's not a controlled pesticide. So with the organic growers, I think a couple of good things are going on. One is that they are much more aware of the need to attract pollinators to their farms. So they tend to leave unmanicured areas, because most of these solitary bees live in rotten logs and in the ground that you don't cut and don't mow, okay? They don't use chemicals that are going to have long-reaching effects on the generations of insects. It doesn't build up the toxic levels in the soils and in the surrounding environment. So I think the organic movement has done a great deal to improve the overall environmental quality. It's not to say that they don't do things that hurt the bees. They do, because if you use the term insecticide or pesticide, that means it kills insects. So, and the organic growers certainly do control certain pests when they need to. The organic farmers, I think, have a different sensitivity. They're willing to, you know, protect the bees for us when you have it on their property. They're very aware of letting me know if they're going to do something that they wonder about. You know, so I think that, yeah, the organic movement has been good for beekeepers generally. For example, one of the things that we would never do, we do apple pollination in the spring, but apples are often the most sprayed crop we have in Massachusetts, I would say, second to tobacco. But not that tobacco is something you put bees on. But with apples, we would never leave bees in apple orchards. We bring them in. Typically they're there for 7 or 10 days during the bloom period, and the farmer would call and say, we have to put a fungicide on, so can you move the bees? And so we would just go get the bees and get them out of there before they sprayed anything. And we wouldn't leave them out during the summer. Squash growers, pumpkin growers, cucumber growers, the rest of those guys, they do some applications as they plant, but they really don't do a lot of spraying beyond that. Once the plants are flowering, it's relatively safe. We can put the bees, you know, 20 feet from the field and don't have to worry about that kind of thing. So, so part of it is the organic growers tend to, I think, be very, very easy to work with in that regard.
Why is organic honey a sham?
You know, that's one of those things that beekeepers argue about quite a bit. There's the idea that there's organic honey implies that the bees gathered the nectar from only flowers that were inorganically pure soil and environment. So if you look at a beehive and draw a circle around a beehive, that's a mile minimum is what they will forage in, and 2 miles is not uncommon. So if you sort of say, for example, I always use the example, we're in Deerfield, Massachusetts. This would pretty much say we have 3 bee yards in the town here. And that would mean I'd have to say that the entire town of Deerfield is organic. Not a possibility. And if you expand that to look at the rest of the nation, the country, there really aren't too many places you can think of that produce honey and can make that claim. So anyone who's being labeled organic for honey still has to be certified, and I would suggest to any consumer, if you're buying something that says it's organic, ask who the certifying agent is, because that will tell you the whole story. If they can't tell you who that is, then you know, it's not organic. So many of us who produce honey will tell you this: you can raise bees organically. There's organic methods, you know, and we would probably qualify for that. But you can't produce organic honey and say it with a straight face without saying the foraging area doesn't count. But in fact, that would be the same as saying, I picked this cucumber from this field that's sprayed constantly, but this one cucumber is organic, therefore I'm okay. So to us, that's the argument. And it's partially because honey is a different kind of a commodity than something you can fence off and have soil that's untreated for 3 years to qualify it as organic soil and meet the various, standards that crops can meet, or even fencing it in. Bees could care less about fences. They go where they want. So all of these controls that you would need to actually protect the integrity of your organic certification aren't really possible with honeybees, any kind of bee for that matter.
How many hives do you have?
We currently run about 800 for honey production, and where we're sitting today is we're in our queen rearing yard. We raise different genetic lines of bees that we sell to other beekeepers and use in our operation. And our goal has been to identify bees that have natural immunities and resistance to diseases and get away from using any chemical interventions, which we happen to believe, as many beekeepers do, that has led to some of these problems we now face. So typically we would probably not want to raise any more than 800 and without adding more help. It's a lot of work.
Do you transport any of your bees?
We move bees in the valley. Most of our bees don't move more than 20 miles from their home yards, but there's a lot on the, if you were to fly over the Connecticut River from about Vermont to Hatfield right now, you'd see clumps of our bees about every mile or so on either side of the river. And that's sort of prime real estate for honey production this time of year. And the farms pay us to put the bees out for their pollination. We do cucumbers, squash, pumpkins, some exotic gourds and things like that this time of year. So the valley's a good honey producing area.
What can those of us who aren't beekeepers and aren't farmers do to help the bees?
Well, first thing I would tell you is be conscious of what you spray to kill things. Most, as I mentioned earlier, the class of pesticides known as nicotinoids is a commonly used pesticide in all the commercial ant killers, bee killers, just insect killing sprays that are sold over the counter. And the attraction of these, by the way, is that most of the studies have shown that these kind of poisons have a minimal effect on mammals. So from the human perspective, oh, these are wonderful toxins because they don't seem to have a big problem for us. However, they attack the nervous system of insects indiscriminately. So every earthworm that comes in contact with this is going to be killed. So not only do these sprays kill the thing you're trying to kill, they kill a lot of the beneficials that we actually need to have. And there are other ways. For example, people don't realize it, but one of the simplest way to get rid of wasps is to spray them with soapy water. It smothers them. Soap creates a film, and bees, wasps, and hornets breathe through little spiracles on their sides. So, and that isn't going to have a long-lasting contamination of that area that kills everything else. So there are easier ways to do it without using the nicotinoids. As I mentioned earlier, if you do lawn care, one of the wonderful things about Massachusetts is NOFA started an organic lawn care certification a number of years back, and when I was on the board of directors, I was just so thrilled to realize that we have the most organic lawn care businesses in the whole country, right in the state. And these guys practice renewable methods of making your yard and your gardens look beautiful, and they aren't using a lot of stuff that's going to hurt anybody or hurt your pets or your kids or whatever. It's a very excellent program. And they've managed to make it as reasonably priced as the commercial guys that are spraying all the chemicals. So look at what you're doing there. The third thing I would suggest is that if you own any property whatsoever, consider leaving some of it in its wild state. That would encourage more ground nesting bees and pollinators, and even if you have dead trees, leave them laying there, because probably 30% of the solitary bees in the Northeast live in dead logs, in old beetle burrows in the logs. If you really want to get ambitious and you have kids, a great project is to drill 3/8 of an inch holes in old boards about 3 or 4 inches in and just make a whole bunch of those and just put them out on trees and things, and those solitary bees will build nests in those holes. So you can attract a lot of the native populations and give them a place to live. So it's a sort of a combination of don't do things to kill these insects and also create more nesting habitat for them to thrive in. Bumblebees, for example, one of their favorite places to make nests is in deserted mouse nests in the ground. So you can take a little lint from the dryer, put it in a box, put it down at ground level, and you can attract bumblebees to set up nests in the lint from your dryer. So there's a lot of levels of this that you can do, but I think the main thing is to be aware that bees are absolutely essential to our survival. If we didn't have these pollinators, and bees aren't the only pollinators, there's hummingbirds and many other insects, beetles and butterflies and what have you. But the bees are the one creature in nature that's sole purpose is to pollinate flowers. All these thousands, these tens of thousands of, and the estimate, by the way, is about 250 different thousand species of bees on the planet. No one really even knows how many. We find new ones in the jungles all the time. But what it is the bee is physically designed. They have pollen baskets. They have little hooks on their hands, on their feet to clean the antennae of pollen, because that's where all their sensors are. They have mouth parts for molding the wax. They grow the wax on their abdomens. I mean, these creatures are absolutely designed to coexist with plants. And I think that's one of the coolest things about bees and flowering plants is that in science we would call that mutualism. And that relationship is where two species are dependent on one another, but neither of them suffer or lose in the relationship. It's like a perfect relationship in nature. And that's one of the real beautiful things about bees. Bees don't hurt plants, they enhance their fertility and help them to reproduce. And plants offer food to bees to attract them. So it's a beautiful exchange of two species.
Massachusetts School of Law. Legal education that is practical, accessible, affordable, and enjoyable. Offering flexible day and evening classes, full or part-time studies, where candidates are assessed not on the LSAT, but their academic and other accomplishments, providing more professional skills training than any other law school in New England. Massachusetts School of Law. Visit us at mslaw.edu, training students to become successful lawyers and advocates, not just legal scholars.
Upon hearing the word bat, most people think of Halloween or scary creatures swarming around at night. But like bees, bats are very beneficial to our ecosystem and even our economy. In fact, a group of scientists at Boston University estimated that bats save American farmers somewhere between $3.7 and $54 billion a year by providing natural, organic pest control. Because each bat consumes thousands of insects a night, a single colony can keep the local insect population in check. But just like the bee's susceptibility to colony collapse disorder, our bat population is threatened by a fungal disease called white nose syndrome.
White nose syndrome is a disease that's affecting hibernating bats in North America. It's a new to science disease. We just discovered it around 2007, and it affects the bats while they're hibernating over the winter. It's caused by a fungus that's called Geomyces destructans, also a new to science fungus. We didn't know that it even existed before we started seeing this disease in bats. The disease has a very high mortality rate. So in areas that we've had the disease for a few years, we are seeing mortality rates up to 95 to 100% in some of the caves and mines where bats are hibernating.
And where is it located right now?
Well, it started out in upstate New York, and since that time it's spread into 19 states. So states in the northeastern U.S., in the mid-Atlantic, Midwest, and southeast U.S. have the disease, as well as 4 Canadian provinces.
And what are the implications?
Well, bats are the primary predator of night-flying insects, so that includes a lot of things like moths and beetles, and both in their adult form and in their larval form, many of those are pests, both crop pests and forest pests. So losing these bats, these primary predators of those insects, really could have a lot of implications for our agricultural and forest products industries here in the United States and in Canada.
And how is it spread?
Well, the bats are pretty good at spreading it among themselves once the disease gets into a site. And because they fly, they're able to carry the disease farther away than other diseases that may be, in animals that don't fly. So the bats do transfer it to other bats pretty easily. But we also believe that humans can potentially track the fungus inadvertently on our clothing, on our footwear, and our gear. So if we're in a cave or a mine, either exploring or doing research, it's possible that we could then pick up some of that fungus and move it to a new site. So it's really important that for us to try to prevent that additional spread of the fungus. You or I could hop on an airplane tomorrow and fly all the way out to California and accidentally bring the fungus a lot further than the bats are naturally going to bring it in that same time period. So it's really important that cave explorers and researchers are decontaminating their footwear and gear and clothing and staying out of caves that are sensitive habitats. So there are some caves and mines that are closed to cave exploration because of this disease. So it's really important to check before you go out exploring.
Since it's a relatively new disease, how does something like this start?
Well, that's a great question. The fungus that causes the disease, Geomyces destructans, we're finding is likely of European origin. It was probably accidentally brought here by humans. We don't really know exactly what happened. It somehow got into a cave or caves in upstate New York. The bats there started to get sick. And from there, they've spread it, and possibly humans have spread it to other caves and mines where bats are hibernating. So the fungus is actually a soil fungus. It normally doesn't affect bats in the way that we're seeing it here. So in Europe, where the fungus is naturally in the cave systems there, their bats aren't dying from white nose syndrome. But for some reason, when it got to North America, it started behaving like a pathogen and causing this disease in bat populations here in North America.
And how many bats does it affect?
Currently, estimates are that over 5.5 million bats have died from white nose syndrome.
Does the prevalence of mosquitoes have anything to do with the decline of the bats?
That's a great question. Bats do eat mosquitoes. I love, one of our biologists told me one time that she thought that mosquitoes were kind of like potato chips to bats. They like them, they'll eat them, but they're not really their main part of their diet. So, the increase in mosquito populations that we've been seeing is probably attributable to other factors, but bats do eat some mosquitoes.
We learned with the honeybees that the increase in pesticides also causes the decline of the honeybees. Do the pesticides play any role in bats?
Well, pesticides actually are quite a threat to bats. We haven't found any links between pesticides and white nose syndrome, the disease, but since the 50s, scientists have been studying the effects of pesticides on bats. And pesticides do cause problems for bats. Bats are mammals. They breastfeed their young just like humans. And actually, bats can transfer those pesticides through their young through breast milk. And pesticides do cause death in bats. They eat not only the bugs, but drink water where pesticides may have gotten into the water, and then they're able to transfer that to their young as well through their breast milk. So pesticides are actually a problem for bats.
And what is the Fish and Wildlife Services doing to help prevent white nose syndrome or curtail it?
Well, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service guides the national white nose response effort. It's now actually becoming international as the disease is in 4 provinces in Canada. We're working with the Canadian government as well. In that response, we have over 100 agencies and organizations that are involved. So everything from state and tribal wildlife agencies, research institutions, and universities, and non-governmental organizations that are all working together to try to address this disease. In that national framework, we have some technical working groups. So we're working on things like disease management, population monitoring, looking for ways that we might be able to interrupt the disease cycle through changes in habitat or whether we could develop some sort of vaccine or medication that may be able to treat bats. We're looking at things like how we may be able to help bats overwinter and survive the disease. So there are lots of different pieces to the national response effort. Specifically, some of the things that we do are develop things like the decontamination protocols so that researchers and cave explorers aren't accidentally tracking the fungus to new sites. We also work with states and other agencies and organizations on restricting access to sensitive sites that may have bat populations. Applying gates to caves where there are endangered bat populations to reduce disturbance and things like that. So we're working in this sort of suite of things, supporting research, getting out and trying to figure out where the disease is, how it's spreading, and looking for those ways that we might be able to interrupt that disease cycle.
Given many people's fear of bats, do you ever encounter some apathy?
Yeah, I think, the great thing about bats is if you get an opportunity to learn a little bit about them, they're just so unique and really interesting. And I know a lot of people are afraid of them. There's a lot of myths out there about bats that are just not true. But I think that although this disease is really awful, one of the sort of positive things is I think that bats are getting a lot more attention in the media. People are learning more about bats and the positive things that they do, that they are very beneficial. Not only, crop pests here in the United States, but around the world, bats are really important for pollination and seed dispersal and things like that. So I think that I hope that that bad rap is sort of lessening a little bit as people learn more about bats, because they really are pretty cool.
So Anne, why do you love bats so much?
Well, bats are really amazing animals. They're mammals, just like humans. So they're young live, they breastfeed them like humans. And one thing that I love, I think is really interesting, is bat mothers can find their own baby in thousands of other babies. So using their sense of smell and listening for their calls, they can pick out their own baby even in a group of thousands of babies. I think that's really cool. They're the only flying mammal. They're the only mammal that truly flies. So there are some animals like flying foxes and sugar gliders and things like that that can glide, but they don't actually fly. So the only mammals that fly. They've also developed echolocation. So because bats are out at night and they feed at night, they can't see the insects. They actually have really great eyesight, which a lot of people think bats are blind, but they actually have really great eyesight. But of course, when they're out flying around at night looking for insects, they can't really use their eyesight to see where they're going and to find their prey. So they've developed echolocation, which is they use sound to identify their prey and also to see where they're going when they're flying at night. So that's really cool. Bats are one of the most diverse groups of mammals on Earth. There are over 1,200 species of bats in the world. Everything from a teeny tiny little bumblebee bat that lives in Thailand could sit on the tip of your thumb, to a Malayan flying fox that lives in Indonesia that has a 6-foot wingspan. So there are bats of all different shapes and sizes and colors. They eat all different types of things. There's bats that are insectivorous and they eat insects. There are bats that eat fruit and nectar. There are even some bats that eat meat. They'll eat frogs and fish, things like that. And there are vampire bats, although not like in the movies. They're not going to suck all your blood out. There are 3 species of vampire bats. They live in Central America, and they eat blood from things like chickens and cows and things like that. They eat about 2 tablespoons of blood when they feed, so they're not draining anything dry and turning it into a vampire cow the next day or anything like that. But they are really interesting. We study bats for a lot of things in the fields of medicine and technology. We study their flight. We study their echolocation. We use that information to develop better ways to fly, better materials for wings of planes and things like that. And we also study them for medicine. So like those vampire bats, for example, they have a special enzyme in their saliva that helps keep the blood flowing. We've used that enzyme to create medicine to help stroke victims, actually. So they just have lots of really cool, different things about them. So I think bats are really fun and interesting to study, And I think they're cute. A lot of people don't necessarily think they're that cute, but I think if you get to looking at all that diversity and all those different shapes and sizes and colors, they're really beautiful animals, and they're really beneficial to us in a lot of ways.
You mentioned the eyesight, but what are some other myths?
Let's see. Well, of course, the bats get in your hair. Everybody thinks that bats are going to get in their hair. One thing that's really cool about that echolocation is it's really, really sensitive. Bats could actually echolocate one strand of human hair. So it's really unlikely that bats are going to get into your hair, although I guess, you know, it's probably has happened if they're flying along, and you probably are more likely to get in their way than they are to get in your hair. They're going to suck your blood. We talked about the vampires a little bit, that bats are dirty and diseased. Bats are actually really, really clean. They're constantly grooming themselves, kind of like cats, and they groom each other and they groom their babies, so they're actually really clean. And bats can be a rabies vector, so it's really important to never handle a bat. But the incidence of rabies in bats is actually really low. It's about 0.5% of all bats have rabies. Unlike other animals that have similar incidence of rabies. So here in the US, those are things like skunks, foxes, raccoons, possums, similar. You're probably not likely to go out in your backyard and pick up a raccoon that's behaving oddly. But if you saw a bat in your house, you might pick it up. And of course, we're a lot bigger than bats. They see us as a threat. If you handle a bat, it's likely to bite you because that's one of its defense mechanisms. So it's really important not to handle bats. Like I said, the incidence of rabies is very low, but you don't ever want to handle a bat just in case. Bats come out at night. They feed at night. Some bats come out a little bit before it gets fully dark, twilight. And there are a couple bat species that'll actually start hunting in the late afternoon. So it might still be light out, and you could see, for example, eastern red bats are one that come out, and they have a beautiful red color. So if you see a bat flying around in the late afternoon and it's reddish in color, that's probably a red bat. Other than that, you know, bats in the summertime often have colonies in human structures. We have built a lot of buildings in places that used to have trees and natural habitat for bats. And bats have actually adapted to that pretty well, some species. So for example, little brown bats and big brown bats are two species of bats here in the eastern US that commonly use human structures in the summertime. So you may see bats underneath your deck or in the slats in your shutters on your windows, underneath your roof line. And in the summertime, those are often either bats that are day roosting. They go out and hunt at night, and they may come back and sort of hang out under your deck. Or in barns and buildings in particular, we get maternity colonies. So in the summertime, bats and their pups, baby bats are called pups, actually the females get together in a group and they have what's called a maternity colony. So the mother bats and the baby bats will all be together in one location. That helps keep those baby bats warm when the mamas are out hunting, and then they come back and stay with the babies in the daytime, sleep in the maternity colonies in the daytime. So you may be seeing bats in the late afternoon and evening in the summertime, and you may see some bats around your house, and those are bats that are adapted to you know, humans being in what used to be their natural habitat.
And if you see them in your yard, is there any danger?
No, I think it's kind of exciting. I think actually a lot of people enjoy seeing bats flying. They're really agile flyers. They're really fun to watch because they turn on a dime. They're just really cool to watch how they fly. So I think a lot of people actually really enjoy seeing bats. And if you, like I said before, if you see a bat on the ground, don't ever pick it up. Don't handle it because it probably will bite you in self-defense. If you have a bat in your house, the first thing that I always tell people to do is, if you can, try to close the door to the room it's in and open a window. Bats will find their way out if they can. A lot of times bats that are in your house in the summertime, they may be juveniles. They're just learning how to fly. They may not be that great at it, so it might take them a little bit of time.
Do bats hibernate in the winter?
here in North America, we basically have 3 different types of bats. We have bats that hibernate, we have bats that migrate, and then we have fruit bats that live sort of in the desert southwest area of the U.S. and down into South America. So here in the Northeast, we have the migrating and the hibernating bats. So once it gets really cold, there aren't any insects for the bats to eat. So they have 2 choices. And some species of bats migrate like birds. They'll fly south for the winter, find a place that there are insects active and that they can feed. The other types of bats, and here in the Northeast we have 6 species of bats that hibernate, they use hibernation as a survival strategy through winter. So they spend the fall getting fattened up on insects. They go into a cave or mine where they're going to hibernate, and they go into a state of very reduced metabolic rate. Their heartbeat slows way down, their breathing slows way down, all of their body systems slow way down. And that allows them to conserve that fat and survive through the winter. Some bats go into hibernation in as early as October, and some bats will stay hibernating into months as late as April. So different species are hibernating at different times, but in general, all 6 of those species here in the Northeast will be hibernating mostly, between November and March is when most of the bats will be hibernating. We do have 3 species that migrate, and those guys all head south for the winter where they can find food.
And what can we do at home to help?
Well, things you can do at home include plant a pollinator garden. This will also help with bees, to provide food for animals, whether that's providing food for moths and butterflies, which, bats eat moths and beetles and things like that. So planting native plants that help support the insect population, and then that'll also help reduce the pests, crop pests and things through providing bats and bees with food so that they can assist in pollination and reduction of crop pests as well. Providing safe habitat for bats, especially in the summertime. So you could put up a bat house that might help provide some habitat for bats to safely raise their pups. You can work on educating your friends and neighbors about bats, why they're beneficial. If you have bats in your home or in your barn, your garage, you can look at different ways that you might be able to humanely exclude them. Don't just kill them, but how can you help either wait till their babies are grown and then exclude them from your home, and then perhaps provide them some alternative habitat like a bat house. And yeah, I think education is really one of the key things, is helping people understand why bats are really important and unique animals.
Is a bat house easy to build? Is it something my kids could work on?
Yeah, there's actually great free plans that you can find. You can get all the things that you need at your local hardware store. Some places will even donate like old wooden pallets and things like that. And we've got a lot of scout troops and church groups and things like that have been building bat houses and educating their friends and neighbors and helping put that habitat up in urban areas that may provide some safe haven for bats.
Are there local groups that work on bat, like bat clubs?
There are a few organizations that support bat conservation. The Organization for Bat Conservation International, Bat World. So there's actually quite a few organizations out there, and I'm sure that there are probably a lot of folks that are interested in bats in all different areas. So you can just kind of poke around and find a group, and there may be something going on in your area that you can find out more about bats.
We'd like to thank our guests for helping us understand and prevent our declining bee and bat populations. And we'd like to thank you for taking the time to watch this program. So get out there and build a bat house or plant a pollinator's garden. But most of all, be informed. Thanks for joining us.